This is one of the most important videos on this channel. This will sound very strange, but the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, what some people in the railroad industry were for years warning of and call a bomb train, and the subsequent evacuation of East Palestine due to toxic gas, and the 2022 movie White Noise, about a train derailment and evacuation due to toxic gas that takes place in the early 1980s near East Palestine, Ohio, a movie in which many residents from East Palestine were in as extras, and another bomb train in Mississauga, Ontario in 1979 that resulted in a fireball explosion 5,000 feet high and the largest mass evacuation in North American history due to the threat of toxic chlorine gas, as well as the largest mass migration of people in North America in the 20th century, which was the exodus of Anglophones from Montreal Island to Toronto and Mississauga in the late 1970s due to oppressive minority laws that paralleled the Hebrews' mass exodus from Egypt in the Bible due to oppressive minority laws, were massive prophetic signs from God that are predicting that there will be a dirty bomb explosion and subsequent mass evacuation from Manhattan Island due to toxic nuclear material and gas on February 3rd, 2024. The date that this video is posted proves that this prediction was made ahead of time, as does this timestamped email and forensic notes PDF. If you are skeptical, please email me and I will forward these to you. Although it has been known since early 2021 that a dirty bomb would explode in Manhattan in the near future, as you can see in this email, this prediction for a dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan on February 3rd was known since at least December 17th. There are also many other videos on this channel that make this prediction that were posted many days before this video was posted. All right, now this will probably be it's definitely one of the most important videos on this channel, but this will probably be my personal highlight here because, as you will see, I was made for making this video. The reason why I'm alive is to make this video, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And so, but there's a lot of information, and it's contained in this email thread that I wrote out to friends as I was discovering and learning things. It will be condensed. It will be full of important information every minute. So, but that's the nature of how I write the emails. But I will explain how the East Palestine train derailment is a massive prophetic sign from God, and it is for the purpose, the main purpose. Well, there's a few purposes, but they're all for God's purpose. And the main purpose, as we will see, is to demonstrate or to confirm the prediction of the dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan and the subsequent mass evacuation of Manhattan Island due to the radioactive material. That's what is hinted at with the derailment of the train and explosion and the toxic waste and the evacuation of East Palestine. And I will prove this, and when this is proven, when this prediction comes to pass, it will prove, one, that the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is the true God, and that East Palestine is a prophetic sign from God, the God of Israel, not some New Age God, not an energy God, not a collective consciousness God, not the God of Muhammad, the God of the Bible, but also it will prove wrong and incorrect the other theories that other people have been excited about on the internet with so-called quote-unquote predictive programming as being the explanation for the events of East Palestine and the coincidences that surround East Palestine. And in doing so, I will also prove that all of the other so-called predictive programming coincidences are not so-called predictive programming coincidences. They are prophetic signs from God, if they are real. Naturally, not every one of these so-called predictive programming things that people talk about are more than a figment of a product of their imagination. But the ones that are real are from God. They're prophetic signs. And this will prove this. This, in other words, will disprove this whole predictive programming nonsense. And it will prove that God does these things. That's the problem. That's the hang up that people that have the predictive programming theory have, is they can't fathom that God would do these things. They perceive these coincidences that they know can't be coincidences, and they don't know what to think. And so, hence the conspiracy theory predictive programming explanations. And those that have these theories that are also Christians or believe in God can't fathom that God would do these things. God doesn't do evil. That's not correct. That's not biblically correct. Okay? God does these things. There's all kinds of passages where we could cite. I'm not going to make this a Bible sermon, a Bible study. Perhaps I should. Maybe I'll do it in another video. But the point here is that God does these things. They are from God. It's God's prerogative to do these things. And the reason why people have the hang up is because they don't correctly understand the Bible. They don't understand the meaning of life. What this is all about. What's going on here with this life that we're in this world. And so God does this. God caused this East Palestine accident. Okay? Not Luciferian FBI agents. Okay? That's the point. God sends evil. They are tragedies. There is evil in them, and God allows this. Let's not forget that God created Satan, and the Bible is filled with passages where God sends this sort of evil. For a deeper explanation as to why these sorts of things are from God, please watch the Willy Wonka prophecy video that I have made that is on this channel. This movie, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, is a gift from God. Definitely. It is brilliant at expressing God's purpose and the meaning of life. And I'm talking about the original classic 1971 Gene Wilder Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, not the Tim Burton Johnny Depp remake, which is trash. So let's begin. I'm just going to read because I don't know how to begin, but I know that I wrote well when I wrote it. I learned of this incident on Sunday night. This was after I had spent the prior 2 days in deep research on the very same subject. So God was leading me to be researching on this weekend that this was discovered, that this happened. Okay, so on the Saturday and Sunday, God had been leading me independently from this news of East Palestine into researching such things. These mass evacuations, and including the biggest mass evacuation in North American history, the train derailment in Mississauga, Ontario, which is where I was born. Okay? And I only learned about the East Palestine event right after, and literally right after, as soon as I was done researching, late on the Sunday night. I clicked on some, I went to find out the news highlights that I typically do. And that was the first thing. It was right after I had finished. And I spent from morning till night the prior 2 days learning about this. And that's what happened. So anyway, that in itself was confirmation for me that this, and as you'll see, there's way more confirmation that the Mississauga train derailment is tied to the East Palestine train derailment, okay? So what has happened here with this ministry is similar to last October when it was learned that Harris's plane crash will be in St. Louis, and then afterward realizing that I watched the movie knowing while staying at the house of my friends in St. Louis. I've only been to St. Louis once. I was there for like a month, but that was the time that I was in St. Louis. It was the only time. And it just so happened that was during that time I watched this movie, Knowing, a movie that God has used. It's a movie from God. It's a prophetic sign. And this movie is about knowing these disasters in advance through numbers, which I explained I made a video regarding this subject, the Knowing Prophecy video. Make sure you watch it. Okay, but the plot of the movie is essentially this ministry, but the plot involves learning about the precise location and timing of a plane crash. And I know the precise timing and location of the plane crash of Kamala Harris's plane, June 30th, 2023 in St. Louis. But the thing is that I watched the movie Knowing in St. Louis. Okay. So anyway, well, the point here is that what happened with this, movie Knowing and me having watched it in St. Louis is very similar to how I had been just studying the same very thing, and then the next thing I learned is the train derailment in East Palestine that ended up becoming the biggest news story for like a month. Okay. So, next paragraph. It was learned a few days ago that the Lord is using evacuation signs. For example, the evacuation of 70,000 at midnight on the night of the Revelation chapter 12 sign on September 22nd, 2017, due to the threat of the dam breaking in Puerto Rico. Also, the meaning of the bridge collapse in Pittsburgh last January on the morning that Biden was there to speak about infrastructure money, his infrastructure package, that coincidence. It was more than a sign. There was an evacuation. There was more than a sign pointing to Squirrel Hill and the synagogue shooting in Squirrel Hill. But it was bus 61B. Obama was born in 1961. That fell into the ravine. And it was also a 16, which 61 hints at, inch gas pipeline was ruptured. And the strong odor of the gas leak caused an evacuation of the area. So this is an evacuation prophetic sign that's pointing to the evacuation of Manhattan Island. This evacuation, due to the 16-inch gas pipeline rupture, was exactly 16 weeks before the oil pipeline explosion at Harris County, as in Kamala Harris. After her plane crash, the Antichrist will replace her. Bus 61 hints at the 16 number, 4 times 4, the 44th president. Harris County, explosion on the date 7/7, which hints at 49, 7 times 7, and Kamala Harris is the 49th vice president. These are major signs that connect to many things, including 444 days after Kamala Harris in High Point, North Carolina, regarding the jobs and infrastructure package, same thing. And 2.3 trillion, which hints at 23, and God pairs 23 and 44 together to confirm the signs and connections. And that was also the same day that the first flight of the NASA helicopter Ingenuity on Mars, and on and on. The point being here is that 44 days confirms the 4 times 4 weeks from the 16-inch, which hints at 4 times 4 gas pipeline and evacuation. Okay. All of this evacuation symbolism is pointing to the evacuation of Manhattan Island. So it occurred to me to investigate prior evacuations in history. That's when I started thinking about evacuations in history. The first thing I came across was the biggest evacuation in North American history. I was completely dismayed and humbled. Similar to the realization about St. Louis and the connection to the movie Knowing. The biggest evacuation in North American history occurred in Mississauga, Ontario in 1979, when a freight train derailed and a 5,000-foot high fireball erupted from rail cars transporting chlorine gas. I was born in Mississauga in 1974. This event is one of my earliest memories. I remember this. I remember the police car late at night, going down the street, and the officer speaking on the megaphone, this was meant to be for me. There are many, many clues and indicators that confirm that my entire life was set out for this ministry. This is one of the biggest. My life began with this incident. Here is yet another example. By pure coincidence, the funeral of the mayor of Mississauga is today, February 14th, 2023. The day I am writing this, I'm learning about the funeral of the mayor of Mississauga. I didn't know. Or maybe I learned the day before, I forget. Honestly, I don't know either way. But I wrote this on the day. The timing for me to write this email happened to be the same day that the mayor of Mississauga, her funeral. Yeah, now it's coming back to me. I would have learned about this a couple of days before this, I think. But anyway, the day that I am coincidentally typing this out for others for the first time is the day of this prophetic funeral. Mayor Hazel McCallion died at age 101 on January 29th, 2023. She was the mayor organizing the emergency response in 1979. In 1979, she was in her first term, having come to office in 1978. She went on to serve as mayor of Mississauga for 36 years. Now, 36 is a prophetic number God uses in his signs as it symbolizes the number 666. Because 36 is 6 times 6, but it is also 2 times 18, which is 6 plus 6 plus 6. And the 36th triangular number, which in a triangle of numbers, the last number in the 36th row is 666. And 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, all the way up to 36, equals 666. And so she was mayor for 36 years. She retired at the age of 93 in 2014. The reason she retired at 93 is because of the upcoming explosion on the surface of the sun, which is 93 million miles away from Earth. This train derailment that she was mayor of during the time is about this massive explosion. It was 5,000 feet high, as I just said. It was seen, from what I recall, from what I read, from across Lake Ontario into New York State. It was seen from many, many miles away. And so that's significant because the sun is many miles away. It's 93 million miles away. And she died at the age of 93. And the big judgment coming is the explosion on the surface of the sun. And in fact, the explosion, dirty bomb in Manhattan also points to that, as I explained in other videos. Have you ever heard of a hurricane hitting Toronto, Ontario? The deadliest natural disaster in Canada since the beginning of the 20th century was a hurricane that hit Toronto in 1954. The nature of the weather pattern of this hurricane was like an atmospheric river, and it essentially focused its destruction on Toronto. It is called Toronto's perfect storm, and Toronto was largely unprepared for such a weather event. 81 deaths. 9 times 9 equals 81, and in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, the number 9 is the most important number, as from the Bible it symbolizes God's judgment. Also, 911 hints at 9 divided by 11 equals 0.8181 into infinity, and so the number 81 is also symbolism for the 9/11 judgment warning. In this hurricane that focused its destruction on Toronto, of all places, because of its atmospheric river, there were 81 deaths, which is 9 times 9. The name of this hurricane? It was Hurricane Hazel. This is how Hazel McCallion, the mayor of Mississauga for 36 years, got her nickname Hurricane Hazel. Mississauga is next to Toronto, along the shoreline of Lake Ontario. In other words, this was God's purpose for this hurricane. to lend McCallion this nickname in order to confirm that this mayor is a prophetic judgment sign from God. All right, I'm interjecting an edit into this video. I produced this video many days before I am making this edit. It has been learned that God is pointing to May 4th, the date 5-4, which hints at 54, and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This storm, known as Toronto's Perfect Storm, occurred in 1954, and the mayor of Mississauga got her name after this storm in 1954, and 1954 and Mississauga hint at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Much more regarding this will be explained in the absolute must-watch 54th Massachusetts Regiment video. The Mississauga train derailment became known as the Mississauga Miracle. Not one soul perished. Naturally, Hurricane Hazel McCallion, was deemed a hero for the action she took in the evacuation crisis. She even broke her ankle in the emergency crisis. 220,000 people evacuated Mississauga. By the way, there were 220,000 deaths in the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. 220 equals 2 times 110 stories of the Twin Towers. 220 also equals rock, which equals Jesus, because the 220th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word for rooster. Peter symbolizes rooster, or rooster symbolizes Peter. And the name Peter is Petros in Greek, which means rock. Also in Bible prophecy, there are 2 periods of numbers of days that symbolize the end times period. In Daniel chapter 8, 2,300 days, and in Daniel chapter 9, 2,520 days. And 2,300 plus 220 is 2,520. This isn't the beginning of this evacuation story and prophetic sign, though. Not even close. This story involving Toronto and Mississauga especially predates this evacuation. This history designed by God begins with another evacuation, the exodus from Montreal to Toronto. The separatist political party in Quebec came to power in 1976. In 1978, they enacted Bill 101, Bill 101, or Bill 101, which regarded French language rights. This was in truth minority oppression laws. Laws unparalleled anywhere else in the quote-unquote free world. Bill 101 is why Hazel McCallion died at age 101. She came to power in Mississauga in 1978 at the time that Mississauga was expanding rapidly due to the biggest migration of people in North America in the 20th century. 300,000 Anglophones fled Montreal. Prior to this exodus from Montreal, Montreal was Canada's premier city. And so the story of the Mississauga evacuation is tied to the evacuation exodus of Montreal. The huge number of people that evacuated due to the train derailment in Mississauga in 1979 were living in Mississauga largely due to the exodus from Montreal. The exodus from Montreal parallels the exodus in the Bible. For example, the majority of Egyptians were filled with hate and jealousy of the success of the Jews in Goshen. Likewise, the resentment of the French of the English in Montreal. Montreal was a majority English city not too long ago and was largely built by Anglophones. In history, the French were directed by the Catholic Church to remain rural. Thus, Montreal was built by Anglophones and was an English city. The story of Montreal is that it is an island that was at one point in history a majority English. It was the English that made the city Montreal. And in history, the Catholic Church directed the French to remain rural and not be a part of the city of Montreal on the island of Montreal. As a result, the French didn't prosper at the pace that the English prospered. Likewise, in Egypt, the Hebrews in Goshen prospered at a pace that the Egyptians didn't. Likewise, Goshen, the area that the Jews were living in ancient Egypt, was in the Nile River Delta. Montreal Island is situated in a river. Likewise, Goshen was situated in a river. These two cities are about a river. Egypt, of course, is about the Nile River, a major river in Africa, and likewise the St. Lawrence River is a major river in North America. The oppressive language laws parallel the laws that enslaved the Jews in Exodus. Interestingly, Montreal was the home of the largest Jewish community in Canada prior to 1976, and now Toronto is the home of the largest Jewish community. The exodus from Montreal to Toronto was nicknamed the Great Flight down the 401, or something to that effect, but a euphemism for this exodus is the flight down the 401, because these two cities, Montreal and Toronto, are connected by the 401 highway, which is the equivalent of an interstate highway in the US. Not only that, this is an amazing confirmation of this prophetic analysis, because the Jews in Egypt were persecuted or afflicted for 400 years. This is what is described in the Bible. In fact, this 400 years aspect to the Jews and their experience of slavery in Egypt is very important to the story of Exodus. And it is astounding that the Exodus from Montreal was down this Highway 401, which is clear confirmation that this does parallel the Exodus in the Bible. This Highway 401 also meets up with another major highway, another interstate type highway in Ontario, the Highway 400. Another very interesting aspect of this Highway 401, is that the full name of this highway is the King's Highway 401, which hints at Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, whom the Jews were escaping. The Hebrews were fleeing the king of Egypt. And the full name of this highway is the King's Highway 401. Also, according to this article here, the Ontario Highway 401 Quick Facts article I'm reading here, there is a section of the 401 that carries 420,000 vehicles on average a day, giving Highway 401 the distinction of being North America's busiest highway. God uses records in his signs to highlight and confirm the prophetic significance of the sign. And this number here is prophetic because this hints at the number 42, 420,000. 42 is a number that is associated with the period of the Antichrist in Bible prophecy. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is a type for the Antichrist. Here is the thing. The Anglophone community evacuated Montreal. It was an exodus and is still ongoing. The city of Montreal is not only surrounded by French-speaking Quebec, but the city of Montreal is located on an island, Montreal Island. This hints at the evacuation of Manhattan Island. In order to confirm all of this epic history as a prophetic sign, God has incorporated Mayor Hazel McCallion, Hurricane Hazel. And this is how this comes together. Hazel McCallion died at the age of 101, and she oversaw, as mayor of Mississauga, the exodus of the Anglophones from Montreal Island down the King's Highway 401, 401, due to the oppressive minority laws from Bill 101, 101. The exodus of the Anglophones due to oppressive minority laws down the King's Highway 401 is a parallel with the Exodus in the Bible of the Hebrews who were escaping oppressive minority laws. The Hebrews were escaping persecution, and so were the pilgrims. There are only two nations in the history of the world that were founded on a relationship with God instead of ethnicity or language: Israel and America. The crossing of the pilgrims to the New World is the spiritual founding of America. The pilgrims saw their crossing of the Atlantic as a parallel with the Hebrews' crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And similar to the Hebrews, the pilgrims were also escaping religious and political persecution from a king, the King of England, which is the reason for the King's Highway in this parallel prophetic sign. And this is why the exodus down the King's Highway from Montreal to Toronto was from east to west, just like the Pilgrims' crossing of the Atlantic was from east to west, and just like the Hebrews' crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land was from east to west. John Winthrop led 11 ships in his flotilla to the New World in 1630. These 11 ships hint at Bill 101, or rather, I should say, Bill 101 and the exodus of the Anglophones from Montreal Island due to oppressive minority laws and persecution is a hint at John Winthrop's 11 flotilla ships. Prior to John Winthrop and them disembarking the ship, before they arrived, John Winthrop delivered his famous City on a Shining Hill speech. His speech is derived from Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, God told the Hebrews right before they crossed into the Promised Land, right before they crossed over the Jordan River, God promised them that they would be blessed if they were to follow him and his ways, if they were to keep his commandments. If they didn't, and they turned away from God, then God would curse them, and he would destroy their nation ultimately. God promised this. In the Bible, the number 11 is symbolism for God's promises. This is why there were 11 ships in John Winthrop's flotilla, and this is why John Winthrop essentially gave a Deuteronomy chapter 28 speech at the foundation, the spiritual foundation of America. And this is why America was blessed. And now this is why America is cursed and is about to be destroyed. John Winthrop went on to become the first governor of Massachusetts, and he lived on and prayed to God on Governor's Island. Governor's Island was later turned into an airport in the 20th century, Logan International Airport, from which the 9/11 judgment warning began with the airplanes that left Boston and then flew into the Twin Towers in New York, the 11th state to join the Union. And the towers looked like a giant 11, and the first plane to strike the first tower was Flight 11 that had a crew of 11 people, and New York City is a city made up of 11 letters. This was on 9/11, because from the Bible, the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment, and the number 11 symbolizes God's promises and the execution of judgment. In other words, through the 9/11 events, God was pointing to John Winthrop's speech and his 11 flotilla ships. In the Deuteronomy chapter 28 passage, God told the Hebrews he would come swooping down on them like an eagle when he came with his judgment. And this is why one of the planes was an American Airlines plane that had painted on its tail a giant eagle. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower also saw their crossing of the Atlantic as a parallel with the Hebrews' crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And this is why there were 101 pilgrims that arrived on the Mayflower off the shore of Cape Cod. And this is why the Anglophones fled Montreal Island due to oppressive minority laws and Bill 101. And this is why Hazel McCallion, Hurricane Hazel McCallion, died at the age of 101. It is pointing to the Mayflower and the 101 Pilgrim passengers. The 101 passengers that began America, and began America with a relationship with God. This is incidentally also why the newly released images of the Titanic, composed of 700,000 images that produce never-seen-before 3D images of the Titanic, highlight the Titanic's propeller and also highlight on it its serial number, and the serial number for the propeller of the Titanic is 101. The sinking of the quote-unquote unsinkable Titanic on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic was a judgment warning from God that pointed to the 101 passengers that crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower at the spiritual founding of America. And this is also why the sinking of the Titanic, with its propeller's serial number of 101 on April 15th, 1912, was exactly 101 years before the Boston bombing on April 15th, 2013. It pointed to the 101 passengers on the Mayflower that crossed the Atlantic to Massachusetts near Boston. And the voyage of the 101 passengers on the Mayflower took an exceptional 66 days, and the number 66 is the 11th triangular number. In a triangle of numbers, the last number in the 11th row is 66. 101 passengers and 66 days, which hints at the 11th triangular number, hint at the number 11, which is the number from the Bible that symbolizes God's promises. And later that year, in 2013, the Boston Red Sox won the World Series, and that World Series began in Boston with a stunning double rainbow over Fenway Park, and the rainbow is God's sign regarding his covenant and promises of judgment. The first two games of the World Series were played in Boston. Boston won the first game, and St. Louis won the second game to split the first two games 1-1, which hinted at the number 11 and John Winthrop's 11 ships in his flotilla that sailed into Boston. And the World Series then moved to St. Louis, known for its Gateway Arch, which is seen from the baseball stadium. And in the Bible, judgment on a people symbolically begins at the gateway. And the Red Sox victory parade in Boston in the traditional duck boats went down the same road where the finish line was for the Boston Marathon, where the bombing took place. The parade stopped at the finish line to commemorate the Boston bombing, and then the duck boats proceeded to enter the Charles River and travel up the Charles River in the same manner in which John Winthrop and his 11 ships in his flotilla sailed up the Charles River. In other words, this is why the Boston Red Sox won the World Series that year. It was so that this prophetic sign could emulate John Winthrop's 11 ships and his speech that emulated Deuteronomy 28 and God's promises of blessings and curses relative to if the people follow God or turn away from God and reject his commandments. All right, since this video has taken this direction, I thought I would just explain quickly, briefly, this diagram. It is part of this video because of the things that I have been saying about the connections involving the number 101. For example, the number 101 serial number on the propeller of the Titanic, and the 101 years connection to the Boston bombing. So let's just go through this very quickly. This was the date of the Boston bombing here. And, well, we talked also about this prophetic sign, which was the victory parade of the Red Sox in the year of the Boston bombing, and how it stopped at the finish line of where the Boston bombing took place, and how the duck boats then went into the Charles River, which alluded to the flotilla of John Winthrop's 11 ships that entered the Boston Harbor and the Charles River. And this was at the time of his famous City on a Shining Hill speech, which was derived from Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is the big message that God is communicating here, that when the nation departs from God, then God will send curses and judgment. And speaking of the Red Sox, that is embedded in this sign too, because the Red Sox are well known for their sports curse, the supposed curse of the Bambino. They were one of 3 major sports curses that all ended during the time of Barack Obama in Washington, D.C. Speaking of that, the day that the Red Sox finally broke their curse was this date here, and this was the only day of a blood moon lunar eclipse that was seen from the stadium during a World Series game. The only one ever in history. That was in St. Louis, and coincidentally, or not coincidentally, designed by God, both of these World Series were between Boston and St. Louis. Now, one of the reasons, well, the big reason is because, as I explained, the gateway arch is symbolic of judgment beginning at the gates, as is symbolized in the Bible, as is described in the Bible. Now, one reason too for the Cardinals, well, sorry, let's leave it at that. But the Red Sox and the 2 other teams hint at the 3 colors that symbolize America: red, white, and blue. The other 2 teams with these sports curses that, and I should say epic sports curses, that ended during the time of Obama and his arrival to Washington, D.C., were the White Sox and also the Chicago Cubs, also known as the Blue Bears. So there's your red, white, and blue. Red Sox, White Sox, and Blue Bears. The 2 other teams besides the Boston Red Sox were from Chicago, and that is because Barack Obama, the Antichrist curse, is from Chicago. But the origin of these sports curses goes back to the 1918 and 1919 World Series, which were the scandalous cheating World Series, when the Red Sox and when both of the teams for Chicago cheated and threw the World Series in order to capitalize on gambling bets. The Chicago Cubs and the Chicago White Sox in 1919. Most people are familiar with the 1919 World Series and the Black Sox scandal, Black Sox being a derogatory term to refer to the White Sox. They played the Reds, and the year before was the Red Sox, and against the Chicago Cubs. And likewise, but a lot of people don't know, is that the first World Series to be thrown in such a manner was actually the year before in 1918, not coincidentally the year of Spanish flu. And because that's another prophetic sign that's pointing to the current judgment, which is the CVD disease. And so that's why the 3 teams there, the Chicago Cubs and the Red Sox, and then the White Sox in the following year. Those were the 3 teams with their epic sports curses that weren't broken until the Antichrist curse arrived in Washington, D.C. And that's because it's symbolic of judgment on America, red, white, and blue. Okay, so this is the day of this blood moon curse. The Red Sox won the World Series 4-0. And that was after they beat their arch enemy, the Yankees, which is part of the sports curse, because the supposed sports curse with the Red Sox is about how they traded Babe Ruth to New York, the curse of the Bambino. And so anyway, prior to them making the World Series for the first time, or not the first time, but in this year when they won the World Series, they were down 3-0 to the Yankees and then won 4 games in a row. And then they beat the St. Louis Cardinals 4 games in a row. And this was in 2004. And this is because it was pointing to the 44th president and Antichrist, Barack Obama, who was elected as senator just 2 times 3 days after this blood moon lunar eclipse, when the Red Sox finally broke the sports curse. And so Obama was elected on this day. Now, the reason for this 2 times 3 is because it hints at 23. And in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, God uses second and third and multiple witnesses to confirm a matter, and this is what makes what is being explained on this channel true, which, by the way, is what the Bible says is required, and this is what makes what is being explained on this channel true and not a product of one's imagination and different and unique than everything else on the internet that claims to be an analysis of God's prophetic signs. And one simple way in which he would confirm with second witnesses is through pairing certain numbers together, especially the number 9 with, for example, the number 23. Not only is the number 23 the 9th prime number, and the number 9, by the way, is because it is the most important number in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, as from the Bible it symbolizes God's judgment. But God pairs 9 and 23 together to point to the president who became president in 2009, who was the basketball president who wore jersey number 23 when he played basketball in high school, and will become the president again in 2023. And also, like the only other president to serve non-consecutive terms, President Cleveland, who skipped the 23rd presidency, Barack Obama will also serve non-consecutive terms, having skipped the 45th presidency. Now, as I mentioned, this World Series in 2013 began with the famous stunning double rainbow over Fenway Park. And that is symbolic of the sign regarding judgment in Genesis chapter 9, the rainbow. And that's one of the reasons why the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment. And God uses exact 9 years connections, by the way. And so this is a very profound connection. And exactly 9 years later was again the Boston Red Sox sign. And this was the day of the sign that pointed to the 11 flotilla ships, and God pairs 9 and 11 together in his signs to confirm the signs and connections. So that this hint at the 11 ships of John Winthrop's flotilla, which hinted at his God's promises, as that is what the number 11 symbolizes from the Bible. This pairs with this exact 9 years connection, which in turn pairs with this 23 connection. And again, this World Series began with the rainbow, which is from Noah's flood, and the Noah's flood in the account lasted for 150 days. And that's why it is exactly 150 days from this prophetic sign to the day that the Red Sox visited Obama at the White House. That's extremely antichrist. This was, well, again, Obama was the thing that ended the sports curses, including the curse for the Red Sox. 150 days is also the equivalent of 216,000 minutes, and that hints at the number 216, and 216 is 6 times 6 times 6, which in Bible prophecy is the number of the Antichrist. Barack Obama was born on the 216th day in the calendar year. Now, in this meeting of them at the White House, which alludes to the Antichrist in the White House, Obama mentioned the quote-unquote 117th Boston Marathon. This is because this hints at the 1117th word in Strong's Hebrew Old Testament Concordance, which is the word Bama, which means high place, because Jesus said that he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. In Luke 10:18, he said he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven, and the name Barack Obama in Hebrew means lightning from heaven. The word lightning in Hebrew is Barak, and the word for Bama in Hebrew is high place, which in the Bible is a metaphor for heaven. As, for example, it is said that Lucifer fell from the high place, a metaphor for heaven. And in the language Jesus would have spoken, Aramaic, the word for from is O. And so Barack Obama is lightning from heaven. Either Jesus didn't know what he was saying when he said this, or he knew that there would be a famous president named Barack Obama and said this anyway, knowing that it would confuse us, or he was revealing the identity of the Antichrist. Obviously, the latter option is the only one that makes any sense. Also, 117 is 9 times 13, and the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment, and the number 13 is, from the Bible, symbolic of the Antichrist. As Nimrod, a type for the Antichrist, was the 13th generation from Ham, Haman, another type for the Antichrist, persecuted the Jews on the 2 13th days of the month, and the 2 Antichrists are described in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. 50 weeks because 50 is the number that symbolizes the church, because Pentecost symbolizes the church, the Feast of Pentecost, and Pentecost literally means 50th day. Also, Pentecost is also known as the Feast of Weeks, hence why 50 weeks connections are extremely symbolic and symbolize judgment for the church, because the main theme of God's big picture of end times judgment warning signs is judgment for the church, which is the purpose of the end times and the Antichrist, a test of faith for the church, of which Jesus, God, is very, very displeased with. This is why also 50 weeks is 350 days, and 350 in Strong's Greek New Testament concordance is the word for examine or judge, to investigate, examine, inquire into, scrutinize, sift, question, specifically in a forensic sense of a judge, to hold an investigation, to interrogate, examine the accused or witnesses, to judge of, estimate, determine the excellence or defects of any person or thing, as in the church. And that's why Obama mentioned 117th Boston Marathon exactly 50 weeks after the Boston bombing in the 117th Boston Marathon. And the finish line that was stopped at by the Red Sox, and in the images you can see on the pavement, the paint is still there, that says the 117th Boston Marathon finish line. Now, this Boston Marathon was on Patriots Day also. There were 3 deaths, and that's why this marathon was exactly 33 years after the 1980 Boston Marathon, which was infamous for having been stolen. There was a cheating scandal. The woman that won the Boston Marathon ducked out of the race, jumped into a subway, and then jumped back out of the subway and into the race again, and crossed the finish line first, the first woman to cross the finish line, and thus she cheated. This was exactly 33 years to the 3 deaths. And that's because the Antichrist will become the president again through a stolen you-know-what. You know what was stolen in order for this to happen, when the current you-know-what will step down because he is losing his mind, which is designed by God, so that he would step down after the thing was stolen, shoplifted. Okay. So now again, this was exactly 101 years after the Titanic sank, and it has a 101 on its serial number. Oh, by the way, That brings me to the other prophetic Boston Red Sox World Series win in 2018. And that World Series also began with two stunning double rainbows over Fenway Park that occurred at the beginning of Game 1 and 2. And at the time of the rainbow over Fenway Park before Game 1 was the crash of the vintage World War II plane that crashed onto Highway 101, which again hints at the 101 passengers and John Winthrop's 11 ships in the spiritual founding of America with the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies. And that's amazing. And also at the time of the plane that crashed on the Highway 101 in Los Angeles, and that World Series was between Boston and Los Angeles, and that's because on 9/11, Flight 11 departed from Boston and was on its way to Los Angeles. Not only that, it departed from Governor's Island, where John Winthrop lived, the first governor of Massachusetts. That's where Logan Airport 9/11 began on Governor's Island, and so they were on their way to Los Angeles, and that's why the plane at the beginning of the 2018 World Series crashed onto Highway 101, and that was also at the same time as the strongest ever storm. Wind speeds were pummeling U.S. territory, the Pacific Islands, which were won during World War II, using these World War II planes. And so that's another 101. Highway 101 is the plane crash. And that's because also the Antichrist curse will come to power again through the death of Kamala Harris in a plane crash on October 17th, 2023, which will be exactly 3 years after 3 people were injured at the finish line of a marathon in Harrisonburg, Virginia. This date was known ahead of time. I thought because it was part of the trail of signs that is leading to the date of the predicted dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan, I thought at this time that this would be the date of the explosion in Manhattan, but it was just another step in the trail of signs. It was the explosion in Harrisonburg, which was a national news story. And it was also and it was known ahead of time because of the connections from these prophetic signs involving Harrison Ford. And that's why this was a stunning confirmation of this. Anyway, there were 3 people injured at the finish line of the marathon, and these 3 people that were injured were students from James Madison University. James Madison is known for being the author of the Constitution, and that's why it's exactly 3 years before the Constitution will be stripped, done away with the Antichrist, and the Antichrist will become the unconstitutional president as if he wasn't already, because he was born in Kenya. But also 36 months is 3 years, and the number 36 is a number God uses to symbolize 666, the number of the Antichrist, because 36 hints at 3 sixes, and it is also 6 times 6, and also 2 times 18, and 18 is 6 plus 6 plus 6, and the 36th triangular number is 666. The last number in the triangle of numbers, the 36th row, is 666, and 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way up to 36 equals 666. Well, these 3 people injured at the finish line of this marathon was exactly 90 months after the explosion, the West Texas explosion on April 17th, 2013. And that tied into the explosion at the finish line of the Boston Marathon 2 days earlier, in which there were 3 deaths. I've explained how the two tie together, but that was the massive explosion in West Texas at the same time as the biggest preparation drill for the same exact type of tragedy in northern Texas, and it was just 50 miles away. And likewise, the Boston bombing occurred just about a month before a planned exact same drill that the region was preparing for, including the FBI, etc., for the exact same type of scenario where terrorists would leave a bomb in a tourist place In this case, the drill was to be for a bomb that was left at Faneuil Hall, the famous tourist location in downtown Boston. And anyway, that's the exact same thing that actually, and then there was going to be a manhunt, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, so that's how the two tied together, and that's how the 3 deaths at the finish line of this marathon can connect with exactly 90 months to the 3 injured at this marathon, and God pairs 9 and 11 together to confirm the signs and connections, and that's why this is confirmed. This 101 years from the Titanic with the 101 on its propeller, in turn connects with 90 months. This is a 9 and 11 connection, which is again hinting at the 9/11 judgment warning, which was God's warning of judgment, destruction of the nation after it would not heed the warning, and the divine protection and blessings would be removed as it was temporarily removed on 9/11, because it all points to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 10 through 11. Also, the reason why, or for the 117th Boston Marathon, which Obama mentioned the number exactly 50 weeks later, is because this date 11/17 also hints at 117, the date that it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash, which will lead to the Antichrist becoming president again. But also, and that's also the date of the explosion in Harrisonburg, which is exactly 90 months after this 117th Boston Marathon. And Harrisonburg, Virginia is in the location of the flight path of Flight 77 on 9/11, which was a flight from Washington, D.C. on its way to Los Angeles, but got hijacked and then was driven into the Pentagon. Well, likewise, Kamala Harris's flight path will also be the same flight path, and it will go over Harrisonburg before it is hijacked by God and brought down in a crash in St. Louis. And so that's also why the reason for because Flight 77 hints at 11 times 7. 77 hints at 11 times 7, which hints at 117. And that's why 117 hints at, is embedded in it, Flight 77, which reveals the date that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash, October 17th, which hints at 117. All right, I have a couple of things to add to this amazing diagram that should have been added, at least a couple of them. One of them was just learned. But anyway, this date here, that Obama was elected senator, again, was exactly 9 years before the duck boat parade into the Charles River, which hinted at the 11 ships, which is a pairing of 9 and 11 that confirms the signs and connections. And what also confirms this 9 years exact connection, and again, the number 9 is the most important number in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel. As from the Bible, the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment. And Obama was elected into the 109th Congress when he symbolically first arrived in Washington, D.C., which is another hint at judgment. But that first day of the 109th Congress was exactly 9 weeks after Obama was elected, which confirms the exact 9 years connection in this diagram. Furthermore, again, as I explained earlier, God pairs the numbers 9 and 23 together, and so this 9 weeks here also pairs with the 2 times 3 days from the day that they won the World Series and broke the supposed sports curse, which is the curse of the Bambino. This is the supposed Boston Red Sox sports curse. It's called, or nicknamed, the curse of the Bambino, which originates in the trade the Boston Red Sox made of Babe Ruth, hence Bambino, to the New York Yankees. And this is why the day that Obama was elected, which is symbolic of the beginning of the curse on America, the Antichrist curse, it was in turn exactly 9 weeks after this date here, August 31st, 2024, which is said to be the day that the curse of the Bambino was broken, which led to them being able to win the World Series. On this day, their star player, Manny Ramirez, who was the MVP, most valuable player in the World Series, this Manny Ramirez player hit a foul ball into section number 9, which knocked out the 2 front teeth of a teenager who happened to live on the same farm that Babe Ruth owned. So Babe Ruth is tied to this because it's the curse of the Bambino. This teenager lived at the time on the farmland property that the Babe Ruth owned, and it was in Section 9, and it was 9 weeks exactly before Obama was elected, which was 9 weeks exactly before the first day of the 109th Congress. Okay, but not only that, what confirms all of this is this stunning thing here. The reason why it is believed that the curse of the Bambino was broken on this day is that the curse of the Bambino is about the New York Yankees and how Babe Ruth was traded to the New York Yankees. And on this same day that the star player hit the foul ball that knocked out the teeth of the teenager that lived on the farm that was owned by Babe Ruth, who was traded to the Yankees had their worst game in their history. They lost the game 22-0 to the Cleveland Indians. Now, the Cleveland Indians hints at President Cleveland, who was the 22nd president. And the reason why God points to Cleveland and the number 22 in this case is because Grover Cleveland, President Cleveland, was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He was the 22nd and 24th president. Manny Ramirez's number was 24, while he played for the Boston Red Sox. After this, I forget which team he played for. I think it was the Los Angeles Dodgers. Actually, it was, and that's relevant too, because the 2 planes on 9/11 were flights from Boston to Los Angeles. Anyway, Manny Ramirez, after playing for Boston, played for Los Angeles and wore jersey number 99, which hints at the 9 weeks and 9 weeks connection here, and also the 9 years connection. But returning back to President Cleveland, who skipped the 23rd presidency. And that's the point. That's why Barack Obama wore jersey number 23 when he played basketball in high school. It is because it points to Grover Cleveland, who skipped the 23rd presidency, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, just like how the Antichrist, Barack Obama, will also serve non-consecutive terms. He will skip the 45th presidency. And 23 is the 9th prime number, and 45 is the 9th triangular number, which in a triangle of numbers, the last number in the 45th row is the number, or in the 9th row is the number 45. And so that's why the Yankees lost to Cleveland 22-0, is because it was pointing to Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th presidents, which is why Manny Ramirez wore number 24. Also, the Antichrist will be defeated at the return of Lord Jesus Christ, which is hinted at with number 22, in 2024, on the Day of Atonement, October 12th, which will be exactly 19 years after Obama threw out the first pitch at the White Sox playoff game, which was prophetic, which is explained in other videos. And pitchers on the pitching mound symbolized the Antichrist on the Temple Mount. And that game led to the White Sox breaking their sports curse, which had been in effect, which began in 1919, hence the 19 years exact from the Day of Atonement in 2024 and the day that Obama threw out the first pitch. The prophetic game-winning hit in that game on October 12th, 2005 was hit by player number 24. And 19 years later, Obama will be defeated on on October 12th, 2024, on the Day of Atonement. And Obama is a White Sox fan, and that's why the Black Sox curse of 1919, the World Series. And that game, by the way, was exactly 1,091 months after the day that Major League Baseball, in a moment of crisis, made Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Mountain means high place, and so does Obama. That's what it means in Hebrew. Obama. Anyway, he became the first commissioner of baseball because of the scandal of the 1919 World Series and the crisis because of the sports betting scandal in which the White Sox threw the World Series in order to profit. And he, the first commissioner of baseball, was given unchecked power over every person in baseball, just like every person in America will be given, Obama will be given unchecked power over every person in America in the moment of crisis in 2024 when he becomes the Antichrist. He'll become the president before then in 2023 in November. And the day that Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was installed as the first commissioner of baseball was exactly 666 days after the 18th Amendment was ratified. First of all, 18 hints at 6 plus 6 plus 6, the number of the Antichrist, and we have this 666 days connection. But the 18th Amendment was prohibition, and this is symbolism for, well, the symbolism in not being able to buy or sell alcohol is symbolism for the coming enforcement of the mark of the Antichrist, which will be enforced through the prohibition on buying and selling food. There will be a food shortage crisis, hence the 1919 Black Sox World Series crisis, for which the first commissioner of baseball was installed. And the coming food shortage crisis will necessitate not necessitate, but will cause the Antichrist and Antichrist system, for that matter. In other words, the blue team, the half of the people that are supportive of the Antichrist, in other words, they will use programmable digital currency to restrict the buying and selling of the rationed food to only those who have taken the mark of the Antichrist. That's why all of this. So from the symbolic ratification of the 18th Amendment, it is 666 days to the first commissioner of baseball, who is symbolic of the Antichrist. And then from that date, November 12th, 1920, I believe. Yep. It is 1,091 months, which hints at 9/11 and the number 19. And he was installed because of the 1919 World Series Black Sox scandal, Chicago Black Sox, to the Chicago White Sox game in which Obama threw out the first pitch, which is 19 years exactly to the day that he will be defeated on the Temple Mount. Hence why he threw the pitch on the pitching mound. He will be defeated on the Temple Mount on October 12th, the Day of Atonement in 2024, at the second coming of Lord Jesus Christ. But anyway, there you go. And also, from the day that the Red Sox won the World Series here on October 27th, 2004, it was exactly 31 years to the day that this asteroid was discovered, named Storm. Now, this is a prophetic asteroid, and the other prophetic reasons for that are explained in other videos. But 31 years, because 31 is the 11th prime number. And this, therefore, is a symbolic number 11. which connects with this 9 years and the 11 ships, which was the point of going off onto this rabbit trail to explain the Boston Red Sox here. Now let's return back to the other amazing things that are being discussed related to the exodus from Montreal and the East Palestine bomb train and the evacuation from Mississauga from the bomb train and on and on. It's amazing. One thing I forgot to mention is that the reason for Harrisonburg and the connections to Harrison Ford is that Harrison Ford is known for his aviation mishaps. He's also known for his roles in acting roles in him as a pilot, and also he is known for his aviation hobby, but he's also known for his aviation mishaps, which is why Harrison Ford's aviation mishaps hint at the aviation mishap of Kamala Harris. All right, October 17th ended up being a step in the trail of signs leading to the date it is predicted that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash, and it is now predicted that that date will be the same date it is predicted that the bombs, the dirty bombs, will explode and the evacuation will occur in Manhattan on February 3rd, 2023. The signs that occurred on October 17th that relate to Harris's predicted crash are explained in the must-watch Gaza explosion video on this channel. As well, in which direction did the Hebrews flee Egypt? The evacuation went east. This is the reason for this evacuation of East Palestine, which is of course hinting at Israel, due to a train derailment and toxic gas. And again, this train derailment and toxic gas, this train derailment in East Palestine, is hinting back to the train derailment in Mississauga and the release of toxic gas. Both of these train derailments also included explosions, and it is expected that there will be a dirty bomb explosion that will lead to the release of radioactive material, which will induce the evacuation of Manhattan Island. God also made it so that the names of the state and province in which these two explosive train derailment events rhyme together. East Palestine, Ohio rhymes with Mississauga, Ontario. Ohio and Ontario both begin and end with the letter O. And in God's prophetic signs in general, God has previously used a number of other examples in which he has made a play on native language names, places that are named after a word in the native language, such as the case with Ohio, which also ends with an I-O, and Ontario, which also ends with an I-O. Also, another example right here is Mississauga and Massachusetts, as I just explained earlier. Mayor Hurricane Hazel of Mississauga is named after the 1954 hurricane, and this is all pointing to the date 5-4, which hints at 54 and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. All right, to confirm his signs, patterns, and connections, his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, God pairs certain numbers together, and this is how God's big picture of signs works. It works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter, as the Bible says is required. And this is what makes what is being explained on this channel true and not a product of one's imagination, and different and unique than everything else on the internet that claims to be an analysis of God's prophetic signs. And if we think about it, one simple way in which he would provide a second witness for us is through pairing certain numbers together, such as 44 and 23. This is because the Antichrist, the 44th president, was the basketball president who wore jersey 23 when he played basketball in high school. And this date of the East Palestine explosion and evacuation due to toxic material, as I'm saying, is a prophetic sign from God that is pointing to the coming explosion and dirty, toxic material that will cause an evacuation from Manhattan Island. And the date of the East Palestine explosion and evacuation was February 3rd, 2023. The date 2-3 in 2023, hints at 23. The predicted explosion and evacuation from Manhattan Island is predicted to be on the date 2-3, which again hints at 23. This is 1 year. The sign in East Palestine is 1 year before the predicted explosion and evacuation in Manhattan. 1 year is 4 + 4 + 4 months. And so we have an astounding connection because of the date hinting at 23 with 4 + 4 + 4 months, which pairs 23 and 44. And this is how God's big picture of signs works. And by the way, the reason or how I know that God pairs 23 and 44 to confirm his signs, patterns, and connections is because I have spent from morning until night, more than full-time hours for 6 years, studying God's big picture of signs, patterns, and connections. I know the numbers that he pairs together. And he pairs 23 and 44. So anyway, we have these, this is astounding. We have this arguably, well, it's definitely one of the biggest prophetic signs that are communicating the coming explosion in Manhattan. And it's on the date 2-3, 4 + 4 + 4 months before the date 2-3, the predicted date. This video was produced prior to April 13th, 2023. If you want to understand and appreciate how the prediction that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan, New York City on February 3rd, 2024 is known ahead of time, it is imperative that we learn about the numerous prophetic signs that occurred on April 13th, 2023. April 13th was the climactic penultimate date in the trail of signs that is leading to the predicted date for the dirty bomb explosion and mass evacuation from Manhattan Island on February 3rd, 2024. And to understand April 13th, 2023, it is imperative that we learn about and understand the trails of prophetic signs that God used to point to April 13th. Through each of these trails of prophetic signs that God used to point to April 13th ahead of time, God told a unique, amazing, and important story that everyone needs to know. This video you are watching will explain one of these stories and their related prophetic signs that God was using to point to April 13th and ultimately February 3rd. And the predicted dirty bomb and evacuation in Manhattan. The prophetic signs on April 13th in turn pointed to May 4th. May 4th, or the date 5-4, as we now know, hints at the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first black regiment in the Civil War, and the reason God has used this theme is because it conveys the theme of slavery and freedom, which is the overarching theme of the Bible and of this life, and the current end times spiritual battle, the battle to end all battles, that we are all involved in right now. This is why, for example, on April 13th, the S&P 500 stock index gained 54 points, and the prophetic hockey game involving the team from Massachusetts had a final score of 5-4. Which hinted at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This is also why, on April 13th, the 21-year-old document leaker was arrested in Massachusetts 21 days before the date 5-4, which hints at 54. In turn, the date 5-4 is 212 days to the date 12-2, December 2nd, and 12-2 hints at 212. This is because the area code of Manhattan, New York City is 212. 12-2 was another step in the trail of signs exactly 9 weeks before the date it is predicted the bomb will explode in Manhattan on February 3rd, and the amazing, profound prophetic signs that occurred on 12-2, December 2nd, are explained in the must-watch Okinawa Obama prophecy video. Arguably, the most important video on this channel, at least in regards to the prediction of the dirty bomb in Manhattan, is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment video. Once the prediction comes to pass, you should know that all of the videos on this channel should be watched. However, there are a few top videos, such as the 54th Massachusetts Regiment video, the EAST Palestine video, the Obama Returns to the White House video, the 3 Mile Island accident video, and the Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory video. As you watch this video that you are currently watching, keep in mind that it was produced prior to April 13th, when it was believed that it would be the date of the predicted dirty bomb in Manhattan. However, like I said, April 13th turned out to be the penultimate date in the trail of signs that led to May 4th and is leading to February 3rd. The prophetic numbers that confirm this. God has incorporated the numbers to confirm what I have just said, which is that all of this is a prediction or is confirmation of the prediction of the dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan and then the evacuation of Manhattan Island. The East Palestine train derailment on February 3rd, 2023 is 1,656 hours before the evacuation of Manhattan on April 13th. Noah and his family evacuated 1,656 years after Adam. In other words, in the Bible, this number 1,656 is associated with an evacuation. The first Jewish grave in Montreal is marked 1776. Mayor Hazel McCallion, Hurricane Hazel, died 1776 hours before it is predicted that a dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan, which will lead to a mass evacuation of Manhattan Island. 1776 also, of course, hints at America. It symbolizes America. But 1776 is also 4 times 444. And America, which was founded on 13 colonies in 1776, will be persecuted by the American Antichrist, the 44th president. And also in the Bible, the number 13, as in 13 colonies, is also symbolism for the Antichrist. As Nimrod, a type for the Antichrist, was the 13th generation from Ham, Haman, another type for the Antichrist, persecuted the Jews on the 13th days of the month, and the 2 Antichrists are described in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. East Palestine is located in Columbiana County, and God uses in his big picture of signs the name Columbia, or Columbus, as symbolism for the nation of America. And so this isn't just a sign for Ohio, it is of course a judgment sign or judgment warning sign for the nation of America, which also includes North America, including Canada. 1656 hours, or 1,656 hours, is 69 days. And this also hints at Daniel chapter 9, the most central prophecy in the Bible, regarding the 70 weeks prophecy. After a period of 69 weeks, the 70th week is symbolic of the beginning of the end times period and the Antichrist's rule. And the dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan is part of the process that is leading to the rise of the Antichrist. This is only scratching the surface for the related numbers between this story and the big picture of signs. At a state dinner in Ottawa, President Richard Nixon gave a toast, quote, "To the future Prime Minister of Canada," unquote, referring to 4-month-old Justin Trudeau. There is something known as the Nixon prophecy. This is the Nixon prophecy. At a state dinner in Ottawa, President Richard Nixon gave a toast, quote, "To the future Prime Minister of Canada," unquote, referring to 4-month-old Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau became the 23rd Prime Minister exactly 7 years after President Obama was elected the 44th president. God pairs the numbers 23 and 44 together to confirm the signs and connections and to reveal the identity of the Antichrist, the 44th president, the basketball president that wore jersey number 23 in high school. God pairs 23 and 44 together in his prophetic signs to confirm the signs and connections, as the 44th president, the basketball president, wore jersey number 23 when he played basketball in high school. Also, this 70th week that I just mentioned in Daniel chapter 9 is in fact a period of symbolic 7 years. This symbolic 7 years in Bible prophecy regards the period of the end times and the rule of the Antichrist. And so the 23rd Prime Minister just happened to be elected exactly 7 years after Obama, the 44th president, was elected for the first time. And Obama was elected on the date November 4th. And presidential elections are on the first Tuesday of the month of November. But that isn't the case with Canadian elections. They can be at any time of the year, on any date of the year. And it just so happens that the first election of Justin Trudeau, the 23rd Prime Minister, was exactly 7 years after the election of the 44th president on this date, November 4th, which is 11-4, which hints at 11 times 4 equals 44. They, Obama and Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, had a state dinner exactly in Washington, D.C., exactly 44 years to the month after the Richard Nixon toast to 4-month-old Justin Trudeau, Justin's father, Pierre Trudeau. Here is a clip of Obama talking about the Richard Nixon prophecy. Here is a clip of Obama talking about the Richard Nixon prophecy at this state dinner.
So tonight, history comes full circle. 44 years ago, President Nixon made a visit to Ottawa, and he was hosted by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Deserves a toast. At a private dinner, there was a toast. Tonight, we'll dispense with the formalities, President Nixon said. I'd like to propose a toast to the future Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Pierre Trudeau. He was 4 months at the time. All these years later, the prediction has come to pass.
And so because the Antichrist, Barack Obama, is talking about this prophecy that is from God at this state dinner, this lends us confirmation that this state dinner with Trudeau and Obama is also a prophecy from God. It is also a prophetic sign. This meeting of the 44th president and the 23rd prime minister that were elected exactly 7 years apart, and this state dinner was shortly after Justin Trudeau was elected. There is a very good reason why God is tying Richard Nixon, Pierre Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau together in this prophetic sign, this Nixon prophecy and this Obama-Trudeau state dinner. There is a reason why these three men are brought together by God, and I'll explain this. And first, Pierre Trudeau is known for having enacted the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act during the Quebec terrorist crisis, which hints at the extremely prophetic Emergency Act, because the Emergency Act evolved from the War Measures Act, enacted by his son, the only other time that such an act was enacted in Canadian history, Justin Trudeau, in the 44th Parliament. The 23rd Prime Minister enacted the Emergencies Act in the 44th Parliament, and his father, Pierre Trudeau, is known for enacting the War Measures Act, which was the predecessor to the Emergency Act, which strips constitutional rights. Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, enacted the War Measures Act in the 1970s, and this is why Justin Trudeau was strangely sporting a 1970s style haircut during the time of the trucker protests and his enactment of the Emergencies Act. God designed that, his haircut, which some people made fun of, his 1970s style haircut, in order to point to the 1970s, and his father, Pierre Trudeau, who enacted the War Measures Act, which was enacted during the Quebec separatist crisis in the 1970s and the exodus from Montreal in the 1970s, and furthermore, the bomb train explosion in Mississauga in the 1970s. And in the prophetic toast that the President of the U.S., Richard Nixon, gave in the presence of Pierre Trudeau, who used the War Measures Act, he toasted to the 4-month-old Justin Trudeau, and 44 years later, to the exact month, Justin Trudeau was in the presence of the 44th president at a state dinner. And this is why the Emergencies Act was enacted in the 44th Parliament. It is to point to the upcoming emergency and the stripping of constitutional rights by the Antichrist, the 44th president, and his partner in crime, the 23rd Prime Minister in the 44th Parliament. Now, the reason why this ties to this subject of the Mississauga miracle, Hazel McCallion, and the exodus of the Anglophones from Montreal to Toronto and Mississauga due to the Bill 101 and oppressive minority laws, is that the reason why Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, used the War Measures Act is related to this. The War Measures Act was used in response to the separatist terrorists, the Quebec separatists, that were the extremists in this movement, in this of claiming French nationalism in Quebec. And that movement is it's a bigger movement than just the separatist terrorists. It's part of the Quebec government as well that enacted the Bill 101 and the oppressive minority laws. It's part of the same movement. And that's how this connects to this. The reason for Richard Nixon in this Richard Nixon prophecy that God has used is because Richard Nixon is known for the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal, as I mentioned earlier, in the Bible, judgment on a people symbolically begins at the gate. And the judgment of the flood is what's hinted at with water. And furthermore, the description in the account of Noah's flood speaks of the waters bursting forth from the deep as if a gate was opened. The reason for Richard Nixon is that the Watergate scandal is about how he weaponized the federal government against his political opponents. And this is exactly what currently Justin Trudeau is doing. He far worse than Richard Nixon. Justin Trudeau is on the level of Antichrist. It's in the beginning stages, but don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that it's light. It's horrific what's going on for those that know what is going on and what is coming. And likewise, when Barack Obama becomes president again, well, actually, arguably, he is already doing it because he is part of the current administration. And the current administration has weaponized the federal government against its political opponents. It too is in its early stages, but don't get me wrong, all that I mean by that is that it's going to get far worse, but it is currently bad. And that's the reason for Richard Nixon and him being brought into this prophecy. And also, incidentally, this is the reason why Justin Trudeau was the keynote speaker at the funeral for Hazel McCallion on Hazel McCallion Day. The annual holiday for Hazel McCallion was the day, coincidentally, of her funeral, and it was a state funeral for a mayor, a very famous mayor. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to denigrate her. But the point is that it was a state funeral, and the prime minister was the keynote speaker, Justin Trudeau. But the reason prophetically for this is that Hazel McCallion died at the age of 101, which points to Bill 101 and oppressive minority laws, which is what Justin Trudeau is and will enact. During that state dinner in Washington, D.C. in 2015, in his toast to Justin, Obama said he had visited Burlington and Mississauga, Ontario. He only mentioned these two cities at first. He didn't mention this, but this was because Obama could not make it to his sister's wedding, and so he visited her and her husband at their home in Burlington and ate dinner at Summit Garden Restaurant in nearby Mississauga. Now, Summit hints at high place, and the word high place in Hebrew is Bama. In fact, the name Barack Obama in Hebrew means lightning from heaven. And Jesus said in Luke 10:18 that he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. The word Barak in Hebrew is lightning, and in the language Jesus would have spoken, the word from is O, Aramaic. The word from is O in Aramaic. And Bama in Hebrew is high place, which in the Bible is a metaphor for heaven. As, for example, it is said that Lucifer fell from the high place, a metaphor for heaven. And also, the high places is a euphemism in the Bible for the false religious worship of false gods, which is the biggest transgression, the first commandment, the high places, because the Jews would worship their false gods on the tops of mountains. And so anyway, the name Barack Obama in Hebrew means lightning from heaven, Barack Obama. And so I'll just repeat that. Justin Trudeau is getting a toast from Barack Obama, who said he had visited Burlington and Mississauga, the only two cities he mentioned at first, and this is because he was visiting his sister in Burlington, and they ate dinner at Summit Garden, which hints at the high place, the summit of a mountain peak, restaurant in nearby Mississauga. In the toast, Obama made a joke out of how he couldn't pronounce Mississauga and said the name Mississauga 3 times. I'll just play a clip of this.
Before I ever became president, when we celebrated my sister and Conrad's marriage, Michelle and I took our daughters to Canada. And we went to Burlington, and this is always tough. Mississauga. And then we went to Toronto and Niagara Falls. Mississauga. I can do that.
Mississauga is the 7th most populous city in Canada. At this prophetic state dinner, the Antichrist said that he had been to Canada, and he said the name Mississauga 3 times, and Mississauga is the 7th most populous city in Canada. This is a clear 3 sets of 7 prophetic sign. God uses frequently in his prophetic signs 3 sets of 7s, because in the account of Joshua, the Hebrews marched around the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho 7 times, once per day for 7 days, and then on the 7th day, they marched around 7 times, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. This was a prophetic 3 sets of 7, and there are also in the judgment account of the Noah's flood 3 sets of 7. Then the walls of security fell and collapsed in Jericho due to God's judgment. And this is symbolism for judgment on America, including from the border wall of security. In other words, they blew trumpets before the walls collapsed, including one long-last trumpet blast. And in English, in archaic English, the word trump means trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet. And Trump's presidency was synonymous with his border wall of security. That was designed as a prophetic parallel with the book of Joshua. America also has another border wall of security, which is the northern border, and that's why the truckers the trucker convoy was a drive from the west coast to Ottawa that paralleled along the border, because that's what Canada is. It's essentially a long strip of land along the American border, because the north of that is uninhabitable. But the convoy went from across Canada parallel the border wall, the border. And what were they doing? As everyone knows, they were blowing their horns, which was symbolism for trumpets. In other words, it was a symbolism for a march around the walls of Jericho while they blew trumpets. And what were they known for in Ottawa? Blowing their horns outside of Parliament, around the perimeter of Parliament, and clogging the streets while the trucks blew their horns. It was judgment on the Parliament that was about to enact the Emergencies Act. And when did they do that? When did the 23rd Prime Minister begin debate on the Emergency Act in the 44th Parliament? On February 17th, 2022. Prior to that date, I was making videos predicting that there would be a prophetic sign on that date. And then this is what happened. It was the Emergency Act. And on that day of the Emergency Act, well, first of all, let's finish that with the date itself. It's also symbolic because February 17th is the 17th day of the 2nd month. And in the account of Noah's flood, it began on the 17th day of the 2nd month. And it began with 3 sets of 7. Also, on 9/11, it was 2 planes that struck the 2 towers 17 minutes apart. And that's also what the date 2/17 hints at, the 9/11 judgment warning, when the 110 stories of the Twin Towers collapsed and Joshua died at the age of 110. And he led the Hebrews, around the walls that collapsed in God's judgment. And furthermore, the collapse of the Twin Towers of the 110 stories engendered a small earthquake that cracked the foundation of Federal Hall on Wall Street, which hints at the walls of security of Jericho and Joshua. And the reason why Wall Street in this is because it pointed to George Washington, the first president, the founding of the country, when after his inauguration at Federal Hall on Wall Street that was cracked due to the earthquake, and that, again, the walls of Jericho collapsed due to an earthquake, by the way. That's proven by archaeology. After the inauguration, George Washington marched down Wall Street. The Hebrews marched around the walls of Jericho to Trinity Chapel at the end of Wall Street, the only building at Ground Zero that survived the falling debris and survived without even a broken window or a scratch due to the 70-year-old sycamore tree, and on, which I explained in other videos. But the reason why God pointed to Trinity Chapel, which is now nicknamed the Miracle Chapel, is because the only building that survived, is because in Trinity Chapel, George Washington consecrated the nation to God, saying that if the nation were to ever turn away from God, it would lose its divine protection and blessings. That was what God was warning of through the 9/11 events. The removal of the walls of security that America has been blessed with throughout its history. So that's the date, February 17th. And I was predicting, for other reasons, other than I just explained, why that there would be a major prophetic sign on February 17th. And I didn't know it would be anything to do, because I knew it about long beforehand. I didn't know that it had anything to do with what was going on in Ottawa at the time. But also on that date, on February 17th in Ottawa, there were these Christians that were marching around the perimeter of Ottawa. Now, I used to live in Ottawa, and this is another example of how clearly this ministry, this video, is the reason why for my life. My life was designed for this, and I used to live in Ottawa, so I know this. How they could have marched around Ottawa and how it could have been symbolic of marching around Jericho. You can march around Ottawa, the perimeter of the Parliament, which takes you across the Ottawa River. And before the Hebrews took Jericho, they crossed the Jordan River. This big story in the story of Joshua is how they crossed the Jordan River and how the river waters stopped in a dam. And anyway, so they began this marching on the 11th. And when they began their marching, they didn't know, and they probably still don't know, the significance of the February 17th, unless they've watched one of my videos. But in the account of Joshua, they marched for 7 days. And on the 7th day, they marched 7 times and blow the trumpets, which would have been the shofar, the sheep's horn. Well, they marched one day, these Christians in Ottawa, they marched around Parliament, judging Parliament, and for 7 days, beginning on the 11th of February, and the 7th day was the 17th of February. And that's the day they marched 7 times around Parliament, and then blew the trumpets. They blew a sheep's horn, a shofar, a biblical horn is what they blew on that 7th day. And that was the day of the Emergency Act. And of course, God is communicating the Emergency Act as a prophetic sign. And because what were they protesting? They were protesting the VACCINE. And in the future, one will not be able to one will not be able to buy food. So the Emergency Act was all about the taking away of the bank accounts of the truckers and those that were supporting them. And in the end, and soon you will not be able, and soon the government will control all purchases of food through digital currency, and you won't be able to buy or sell, as Bible prophecy says, this food unless you have taken the VACCINE. And that's why the Emergency Act in relation to what they were protesting. Now, there's more to this. You know, they were clogging the streets of Ottawa, and they clogged the bridge crossings, and those were arteries. They clogged the main trade artery, and they clogged the streets of Ottawa because that was symbolism for the clogged arteries that are a result of taking the you-know-what. And also, 93 days later, after the Emergency Act signed, was the day of the derecho storm that knocked out power for 900,000 people in Ottawa. Number 9 is the most important number, symbolizes God's judgment. And this derecho storm was a straight line. That's what a derecho is. It's a straight line storm. And where did it exactly begin? It began precisely at the Windsor Bridge, the trade artery, the biggest trade artery between the U.S. and Canada, and for that matter, the biggest border crossing of business for America. That's where the storm began, and it went directly to Ottawa. And the reason for 93 days is because it hints at the 93 million miles away that the sun is. And there's more to this, which I explained in another video, but that was the February 17th was also the day of the release of the new Elvis movie, which is about Elvis, King Elvis, and Sun Records, which is hinting at the sun, and Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, which hints at the Parker probe that's around the sun, going around the sun. And also goat is Antichrist symbolism, and goat stands for greatest of all time. And on the day of the derecho storm, we had the prophetic sign, the Antichrist goat, greatest of all time of boxing, Floyd Mayweather, in a prophetic sign with him in a boxing match, which is explained in the other video. And this Mayweather sign was in May. It was on the day of the derecho storm, May 21st. A derecho storm is weather, hence the Mayweather, Floyd Mayweather sign, which is also hinting at the coming space weather from the sun, which is explained. But also the derecho storm is also a derecho is a type of punch in boxing. And that's the derecho storm was hinting at the punch that's coming soon, next February, from the sun that will cause catastrophic blackouts. And this is why the main thing about the derecho storm was how it knocked out the power, the blackout for 900,000 people in Ottawa, where the Emergency Act was initiated debate on 93 days earlier, which hints at 93 million miles the sun away from Earth. Also, the derecho storm was a straight line, which was symbolism or hinting at the convoy, the straight line of the convoy of the truckers that were blowing their horns, which was communication from God of trumpet judgment along the border wall of security, just like the trumpets were blown. I'll repeat that. This storm that was named in the American media Canada's derecho is a straight line storm, and this was on the other side of the border wall of security of America, and the trucker convoy was all about the blocking of the Windsor Bridge trade artery, and the convoy that went in a straight line across and parallel to the border outside of the border wall of America there. Now, what is astounding beyond words relative to this video, which is the prediction that the dirty bomb will explode in Manhattan on April 13th, 2023, is that the day of this prophetic Emergencies Act on February 17th, 2022, is exactly 420 days before the date it is predicted that there will be an emergency in Manhattan with the predicted dirty bomb explosion and mass evacuation of Manhattan Island. This is astounding because in the Bible, 7 times in Bible prophecy, there is a period of 42 months as related to the period of the Antichrist in the end times. And so 420 days hints at the number 42, which is symbolism for the end times period of the Antichrist. However, also, the number 42 appears in the Bible, including in the Old Testament, in context of slaughter. For example, in the Old Testament, there were 42 cities in which people could seek refuge for manslaughter. Also, the she-bear in 2 Kings slaughtered 42 boys. Also, 42 descendants of King Ahab were slaughtered at the pit by King Jehu. Likewise, the number 42 in the book of Revelation is in context of the Antichrist and the coming slaughter from the Antichrist. And so that's also why this is astounding, because this is what we are talking about from this Emergencies Act, which is also symbolic of an emergency. It is exactly 420 days to the date it is predicted that there will be a slaughter in Manhattan. Also, the reason why 420 is prophetic is because it is a divisor of God's end times number, which is 2,520 from Bible prophecy. 2,520 divided by 420 is 6. And it just so happens that 420 days is exactly 60 weeks, which is more confirmation of this. The fact that 420 is prophetic because it is a divisor along with the number 6 of 2,520. And man was created on the 6th day, which is why The number of the Antichrist is 666. And for those that don't know, the days mentioned in the account of Genesis of creation are not referring to 24-hour periods. Okay, so returning back to this 44th president and the Richard Nixon prophecy, we have 44 years exactly to the month after the toast to the 4-month-old Justin Trudeau. We have in 2015 Barack Obama giving a toast to Justin Trudeau. And he's saying that he has been to Burlington and Mississauga. And he says the name Mississauga 3 times. And Mississauga is the 7th most populous city in Canada. And so this is a clear 3 sets of 7. Which, again, we have a 3 sets of 7 in Ottawa on that day with the Christians marching around Parliament, in judgment from God, God's people demonstrating his judgment on Canada, because Canada and America are about to be destroyed. All right, so the dinner so the state dinner and mention of Mississauga, the location of the biggest evacuation in North American history, which will be a big emergency for which the Emergencies Act hints at, which ties to the evacuation of Montreal Island, was exactly 370 weeks before the predicted evacuation of Manhattan Island. This is so mind-boggling. When I learned this, I learn like things like this all the time, but it's just so amazing. It's exactly 370 weeks. 370 weeks hints at 3 sets of 7 in the state dinner. There was a 3 sets of 7 in the state dinner because Mississauga is the 7th most populous city, and Barack Obama, in his attempt to make a joke, he mentioned Mississauga 3 times, and exactly 370 weeks from that day, which hints at 3 sets of 7, is the date it is predicted that there will be a mass evacuation from Manhattan Island. And Mississauga was the place of the biggest mass evacuation in North American history. After correcting his Mississauga pronunciation joke, he quickly said, okay, I'm going to say this now. I might say it later because I can't remember everything that I wrote. But Mississauga is made up of 11 letters, and so is New York City. That's another connection here. So from, Obama's mentioning Mississauga 3 times, the 7th most populous city in Canada, a name that's made up of 11 letters, it is exactly 370 weeks, which hints at 3 sets of 7, to the predicted date of the dirty bomb explosion in New York City. And New York City is made up of 11 letters. And in the Bible, the number 11 is symbolism for the execution of God's judgment. It appears in context of the execution of God's judgment in the Bible. And that's why, for example, on 9/11, it was Flight 11 with a crew of 11 people that hit the Twin Towers that looked like a giant 11 in New York State, the 11th state to join the Union, in New York City, a name that's made up of 11 letters, because Jesus coined the phrase the 11th hour, which in ancient Israel referred to the last hour of daylight before darkness, and in English is an idiom that means last chance. Time is running out, as in the last chance for America to repent and turn back to God before judgment destruction, and likewise Canada. Okay, because arguably Canada and America both are God's Gentile nations. There are only 2 nations in history that were founded on a relationship with God, America and Israel. And Canada was, the colonies were American until they had a civil war, the Revolutionary War, which created the border between Canada and the U.S. Okay. All right, so the prior few minutes was produced before April 13th. It is now mid-August, and more understanding has come to light here. And the reason why Mississauga, for example, is 11 letters and it connects to this explosion's predicted evacuation of New York City, in New York City, which is made up of 11 letters, is because this hints at John Winthrop's 11 flotilla ships, which is what is hinted at with Bill 101, which ties to the mayor of Mississauga who died at the age of 101, as has been explained. And that information only came to light, was realized after the recent Titanic sign, the release of the new images that highlight the propeller's serial number, 101, and after the recent Titanic submarine sinking sign, I did a little more research and more connections were made, and I noticed that there were 101 passengers on the Mayflower that arrived. So now it all makes sense. So anyway, that's why the 11 letters. It also hints at 101 and the oppressive minority laws of the Antichrists. Small letter A for Justin Trudeau, capital A, if you will, for Barack Obama, simply because there are two Antichrists described in the book of Revelation, and Barack Obama is the second of the two. Pope Francis is the first. But that said, there is mention of the 10 kings, and I suspect that Justin Trudeau is one of these 10 kings that prop up the Antichrist and Antichrist system. But what I also wanted to point out here too is that, like I said, this was produced before April 13th, and like I said, April 13th was 100% correct. The prophetic signs on that date revealed, confirmed all of the analysis, including this 370 weeks connection. This is how the big picture of signs works. If you don't believe that, if you're skeptical, if you scoff, fair enough. But when the prediction comes to pass, it will prove this. This is the purpose of the prediction. It will prove what I am saying, which is that the analysis for April 13th was 100% correct. It wasn't quote unquote wrong. And you will know that when you watch, for example, the videos that explain what happened on April 13th, specifically the 54th Massachusetts Regiment video, especially. That said, from April 13th, we had the prophetic signs that revealed adding 3 times 7 days, which is a hint at 3 sets of 7, to get us to May 4th, which was a date that was hinting at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And that's why, for example, one of the prophetic signs on April 13th was the arrest of the 21-year-old document leaker in Massachusetts. The reason why the big part of the story was his age is that it hints at 3 sets of 7. Anyway, that's all explained in the other video. But the 3 sets of 7 days following April 13th is confirmation of the 370 weeks connection that precedes it, as shown in this screen from March 10th, 2016, the date of this state dinner, when Obama made the Mississauga joke. Okay, and so, the other video will explain adding why 12 times 12 days and so many amazing things, and how we get to September 25th, the date of the predicted dirty bomb explosion and mass evacuation from Manhattan Island, which is hinted at in context of this video with the evacuation from Montreal Island to Mississauga. So after correcting his Mississauga pronunciation joke, he quickly said, quote, "And then we went to Toronto and Niagara Falls," as like an afterthought. That was part of his joke. He's like, "And then we went to Toronto and Niagara Falls," the places that everyone's heard about. And are easy to pronounce. Okay, so Niagara Falls is also, of course, prophetic. It is a high place, Bama. The name, as I mentioned earlier, the name Bama is Hebrew for high place. But also, 3 sets of 7 relate to the fall of the walls of security of Jericho, as well Niagara Falls and the barge are Noah's flood symbolism, and there are 3 sets of 7 in the account of Noah's flood. So let me explain. God is using Niagara Falls in his prophetic signs, and specifically, it's about this historic barge that has been stuck on the rocks of the Niagara River since 1918, the year, not coincidentally, of the Spanish flu pandemic. And this barge moved for the first time in 2019. That's another sign that's talked about in other videos. But Niagara Falls is symbolism for the power of water moving over the earth. It's symbolism for Noah's flood. The barge is symbolism for Noah's Ark. And the barge was involved in the most historic, dramatic rescue in Niagara Falls history, involving the U.S. Coast Guard, which brings in American national symbolism. And this rescue, of course, with this barge, is hinting at the rescue of Noah and his family in the ark. Also, Niagara Falls engenders a perennial rainbow. And the rainbow is God's sign regarding judgment in the account of Noah's flood. In the last verse 9:17, and Obama was president from 2009 until 2017, and Obama is the rainbow president, who famously lit up the White House in rainbow colors. Okay, on the 9th of Tammuz, and the 9th and 17th of Tammuz were the 2 dates in history when the Babylonians and the Romans breached the walls of security. That's another reason for 9 and 17, and why Obama was president from 2009 until 2017. Okay, so not to get off onto that rabbit trail any further, the point here, though, is that in this prophetic state dinner, the Antichrist said that he had been to Niagara Falls. So the dirty bomb in Manhattan will be exactly 1,260 days after the barge moved. Okay, so there we go. This is relevant, extremely relevant, actually. The date of the predicted dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan will be 1,260 days exactly after the barge moved on October 31st, 2019, which was a 9/11 symbolism storm. So first, let me explain. 1,260 days is mentioned 7 times in Bible prophecy as being the period of the Antichrist's rule in the end times. It's extremely prophetic. It's 3.5 biblical years, prophetic years, made up of 12 months of 30-day months. The barge moved because of the Halloween storm. It was this big storm that knocked out all kinds of power in the area and created epic historic flooding in eastern New York State and western New England. And that's because God was pointing at the flight paths of the 2 planes from New England that slammed into the 2 towers in New York on 9/11. They went over this area, and there was 1 death, which confirms the prophetic significance of this, because the death lends to this. If you know God's signs, the 1 death is symbolically important. And so that's why it was a 9/11 sign. And there's way more to that, which I won't get into. Well, I suppose I have to add a couple of things here. This was the day of the beginning of the Maria fire in California, which burned 9,999 acres. That's, if you look it up on Wikipedia, that's what it says. It's 9,999 acres. This day of the Maria fire and the barge moving for the first time in 101 years. By the way, and that in itself is a pairing of 9 and 11, because 101 hints at 11, as does Bill 101. Oh, I didn't even realize that till I was recording this just now, because of course we're talking about Hazen McCallion, who died at the age of 101, and Bill 101, and that's what really this is all about, because this hints at the Mark of the Beast laws, which is what the Emergencies Act hints at, which is the not being able to buy or sell unless you take the thing. And that's the oppressive minority laws, which is hinted at through the exodus of the people from Montreal, which points to the Bible, and the exodus from the persecution of Pharaoh in Egypt, and a type for the Antichrist. And so anyway, this barge moved for the first time in 101 years. And on the same day, it was the 9,999 acres. And that, of course, hints at 9/11. God pairs 9 and 11 together to confirm the signs and connections. And that's how God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections works. It works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter, as it says is required in the Bible, and that's what makes what is being explained on this channel true and not a product of one's imagination, and different and unique than everything else that claims to be an analysis of God's prophetic signs on the internet. And so also, this was a 9/11 sign, as I just explained, this moving of the barge for the first time on the day of the 9/11 storm in eastern New York and western New England, which points at the flight paths of the planes on 9/11, but also it was exactly 110 weeks after the evacuation in the middle of the night due to the threat of the dam bursting in Puerto Rico that was caused by Hurricane Maria. And so the 9,999 acres connects with the 110 weeks exactly from the Maria fire back to the Maria hurricane and the dam threat, which was a prophetic sign. And there's more to that because it was the day of the Revelation chapter 12 sign, which is about a birth. And Maria, of course, that's what's hinted at, was the woman that gives the birth in Revelation chapter 12. But anyway, that's the 110 weeks, and that's also 9/11 because there was 110 stories of the Twin Towers that collapsed. And so that's why the 9,999 acres connects with exactly 110 weeks to the Hurricane Maria. But also Hurricane Maria killed about 3,000, quote, about 3,000, because on 9/11 it was 2,996 deaths officially, and in the book of Exodus, when the Hebrews exodus from Egypt at Mount Sinai after their rebellion, quote unquote, about 3,000 souls perished. And that's what God was pointing to with the 2,996 souls that perished on 9/11. And also there was about 3,000 deaths due to Hurricane Maria. Also, the barge moved for the first time in 101 years, which again hints at Bill 101 and the connection to the train derailments in East Palestine and Mississauga. And Bill 101 and Hazel McCallion, Hurricane Hazel McCallion, speaking of storms, because the barge moved because of a storm. 101 years also hints at 11. You take away the 0, you get 11, and that's also 9/11, as I just explained. But also, it's predicted that 1,260 days after this will be the day of the predicted dirty bomb explosion in Manhattan, New York City, which is a name made up of 11 letters in New York State, the 11th state to join the Union. One thing I don't think I emphasized enough is that the barge moved for the first time in 101 years, exactly 110 weeks, which is also hinting at 11, after the evacuation in the middle of the night. 70,000 people were evacuated in the middle of the night due to the threat of the dam bursting. And they had to go knocking on doors because of the power outage. There was no phones. Most of the residents were relying on phones. And so they had to go knocking on door-to-doors in the middle of the night, warning them, which is hinting at Matthew 25 and the midnight cry and the evacuation of God's people at the rapture. But anyway, that's more emphasis of this evacuation symbolism. And as I've just explained, it's exactly 110 weeks from that evacuation, 70,000 people, to the barge moving for the first time. The Maria Dam and the Maria hurricane that caused the dam damage, that threatened the dam burst, that's all Noah's flood symbolism, as is Niagara Falls and the barge, as I just explained. So anyway, it's 110 weeks exactly between those two, and then another 1,260 days, as I'm saying, from the barge moving to the day of the predicted evacuation in Manhattan, in the 11th state to join the Union. But anyway, 1,260 days from this barge sign, which is symbolic of beginning of judgment, because when the barge finally crashes over Niagara Falls, which is predicted to occur, by the way, on February 17th, the 17th day of the second month in 2024, that will be a massive symbolic sign of the beginning of judgment. The explosion on the surface of the sun will be 120 hours later. And in the account of Noah's flood, on the 22nd of February, and in the account of Noah's flood, God gave Noah the number 120 in regards to the timing of the beginning of judgment. Okay, so where was I? So, okay, also, Toronto and Mississauga, for that matter, are symbolism for the Tower of Babel story. This is represented by the CN Tower, and the immigrants speaking a multitude of languages from all over the world. That's essentially Toronto. It isn't a Canadian city. It's an international city, and that's by design by the godless globalists that seek to make the world international and eliminate nationalism and patriotism. And when the place you live in is overwhelmed by other cultures, you don't really feel like you are from there anymore, like myself, for example, because obviously it doesn't mean anything. And that's the whole point of bringing in multitudes of people that's from all over the world. But anyway, Toronto is one of these Anglosphere cities that really epitomizes this, like Sydney or London. And it also is known for its tower. So this is really, truly a Tower of Babel city. Truly, literally, right? Symbolically. It's not an accident. And that's why this comes up in this prophetic sign, in fact, why Obama is mentioning it. Because the Tower of Babel city is all about the Antichrist. Nimrod and the Tower of Babel is a type for the Antichrist and the world coming together under his rule, the Tower of Babel. And in the name of technocracy, in the name of technology, the tower, the building of the tower, that, you know, the attempt to reach God, to reach the heavens and to become like God, and conquer the creation by man without God, is symbolic of today's technocratic movement and authoritarianism involving the thing that people take, which is originally, I'm going to try to say this without saying the word, it's originally designed for changing, modifying one's chromosomes, okay, if you know what I mean. That's what the technology is. But it's technocracy and transhumanism, the modern day form of eugenics, which is the rule of the elite, the experts. They they dictate, and that's essentially authoritarianism, and free speech must be censored because the elites must be able to dictate because they know best, the technocrats. Okay, anyway, so that's another subject though. But going on, that's what Tower of Babel is here in this story here, Toronto. So as I wrote, this is represented by the CN Tower and the immigrants, as I just said, speaking a multitude of languages from all over the world. The Tower of Babel story is right after the flood, and that's why in Obama's toast, he mentions Toronto and Niagara Falls right after each other. He visited those two places right after one another. Also, Obama said he visited Burlington and Mississauga. Coincidentally, these are the very two cities I grew up in and went to high school in. These are the two cities I went to high school in, which is more confirmation that it is God's plan that I discover this, for example, exact 370 weeks connection from the date that Obama said this. Who else could have remembered he said this and then looked this up? I mean, I grew up and went to high school in Burlington and Mississauga, and Obama mentions these two places, and no one else could have done this. No one else could have looked up how many days it is between that and the dirty bomb explosion that's predicted in Manhattan to find that it's exactly 370 weeks, which hints at 3 sets of 7. And Obama mentioned Mississauga 3 times, and Mississauga is the 7th most populous city, which is the 3 sets of 7. So in other words, this 370 weeks connection is amazing beyond words confirmation that the story of Mississauga and Montreal Island is a prophecy that points to Manhattan Island. And it's also confirmation that this video I am making was part of the plan for my life. But so anyway, yes. So the point is that the personal connection is also in itself, if you will, just more confirmation of this story and connection between the evacuation and exodus of Montreal and Mississauga and the coming predicted evacuation of Manhattan Island. Now, to bring this full circle, the reason why God brought these 3 men together, as I mentioned, with this Nixon prophecy and this fulfillment of the Nixon prophecy with this state dinner between Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama. The three men I'm talking about are Richard Nixon, Pierre Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau. Is that what is Richard Nixon known for? Richard Nixon is known for Watergate. What is Watergate? Besides Noah's flood symbolism, which is explained in other videos or elsewhere in this video. Watergate is about how Richard Nixon used the federal government and weaponized the federal government, or tried to weaponize the federal government in order to persecute his political opponents, which is exactly what the Emergency Act is, enacted by Justin Trudeau. And if you don't recognize that, that's because, no offense, but you have been susceptible to the propaganda, or you really are a true believer of the political cult of the left, and you're just blinded, and you really do see yourself as morally superior, and you really do see the truckers as being a threat. Either way, the point is that that's what God is communicating, and the prediction in this video, the purpose of this prediction that is from God, is to prove the things that I am saying. That is the purpose of it, of this prediction. And what I am saying is that God is saying that the Emergencies Act is a prophetic sign, a foreshadow, a hint at what is coming, which is the political persecution through the weaponization of government of political opponents in this developing literal civil war between secularists, materialists, liberals, leftists, and conservatives and true Christians. That's the civil war. And anyway, this is all prophetic because, if you are not aware, Bible prophecy talks about Christians being persecuted at the end by the Antichrist. That's the point. And the thing, and you know what I'm talking about, the thing that you can't talk about, the thing is merely, although maybe some people aren't conscious of it, but it is a fact that it is simply a weapon used by one segment of the population on the other. It's to demonize, it's used to demonize the other half that see it as being unethical and unrighteous, and among other things, and unnecessary, and deadly. And even though the information regarding that is overwhelming, the members of the political cult ignore it and see them taking the thing as an act of fealty to the cult. It's a demonstration of commitment to the ideology and the cult, even though they know that the thing is dangerous. So anyway, but that's what it's all about. It's a spiritual war. It's a civil war, but it's also a political war. It's an ideological war, and one side is propping themselves up by virtue signaling with these CVD disease things to signal to the other members of their tribe that they are superior. That's what masks are, for example. Every cult uses some form of clothing modification to induce tribal affiliation between each other and to separate themselves, distinguish themselves from the other group, and to encourage indoctrination. Political cults, and there are different kinds. There's political, religious, health cults. There's 4 different kinds from what I recall. But this is a political cult, and if you have the eyes to see it, a religious cult. Because for the godless left, there's a void, and they've made politics their religion as a replacement religion, the political left. And anyway, that's the reason for the face cloth cult. Of course, prior to CVD disease, there was no scientific evidence that face cloths work for stopping the spread of things that float in the air. All of the scientific papers demonstrated overwhelmingly that face cloths do not work. And every government, every modern developed government had as its contingency plan for a possible pandemic the advice to not wear face cloths. But all that changed on a dime due to things which that's just going off onto a rabbit trail. Just follow the science is the most unscientific thing that has ever been said in the history of science. And the science in this case was overwhelmingly the case that obviously the cloth things don't work because, for example, the virus is a half a micron in size and cloth things don't filter out anything above or below 3 microns, just for example. But also they're unhealthy and spiritually they're dark. They symbolize the erosion of the sovereign individual person, which is inherent in collectivist, satanic, demonic ideologies. My point here, I guess, just to summarize again, is that the reason for Richard Nixon and Pierre Trudeau and the two prime ministers in Canadian history that enacted these Emergencies Act that stripped civil rights and it's all because God. That's what God's pointing to. It's the mark of the Antichrist laws that will be used to persecute their enemies, true conservatives and Christians. And another thing too is that Pierre Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act during the crisis that was the result of the political cult of the French separatists, which is related to the exodus from Montreal Island. And so it all ties together because what we are talking about is how the exodus of Montreal Island is connecting to the mass evacuation of Manhattan Island through these train derailments and evacuations in Mississauga and East Palestine. And so the War Measures Act was enacted, it's all connected because it connects to the history of Montreal and the reason for the exodus to Mississauga. These evacuations also point to the evacuation of the rapture, which is why the train derailed in Mississauga 7 minutes before midnight. The midnight cry in Matthew 25. This is the end of part 1 of this video. There is much more amazing information to explain in part 2. With the foundation being explained in part 1, we have now warmed up, and now we can take off and more amazing information can be explained in part 2. Make sure you watch part 2. Also, the information in part 2 is extremely important. And as I said at the beginning of this video, this is one of the most important videos on this channel. This video isn't finished. You need to watch part 2. I will leave a link to part 2 in the description box below this video.